Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the much coveted Friday morning session slot. Yeah. My name is Alex Frankel, and I'm here with Brian Moore. We're both program managers on the newly formed ARM deployments team. And today we're going to be talking about what's new with Azure Resource Manager template deployments. I was checking the max occupancy in the room, and it's about 2,000 people. And for those of you who are live streaming at home, every single seat is filled. We're absolutely packed. I want to start by saying that, for those of you who have been involved in this community over the last few years, you've known that we just really haven't invested enough in this space. So what we're going to be talking about today more than anything is setting a new direction for ARM templates and showing that we really have a renewed focus on ARM template deployments. Most of the top Azure customers are actually using ARM templates every single day for their most critical production workloads. So it's vital that we continue to invest in this space and take it to where we know what it can really be. Any brand new ARM template people? Any beginners? A few of you, awesome. Okay, cool. So an ARM template is a declarative document for describing your Azure resources. So it's all written in JSON, but as you can see here with some of the syntax highlighting in the comments, it's actually kind of a meta language within JSON. So you have things like parameters and variables and functions and comments. So there's a lot of syntactic value and kind of rich language, but we hadn't really treated it as a language before. If you are new, I highly encourage you to check out our brand new ARM template tutorial. You can go to aka.ms/justlearnarm. It really takes you very slowly through all the different phases of the ARM template lifecycle and all the different language features that you can use. So we've totally redesigned it end to end, and I encourage you to check it out. Especially those colleagues that I know you all have that have told you that ARM template authoring is too hard, I don't like JSON, I don't want to do it. Point them here and see if this makes a difference, because we've gotten really, really good feedback on it. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the improvements we've made to VS Code authoring with our VS Code extension. If you've been paying attention in the last 6 or so months, you've actually seen quite a few material updates. In particular, things like syntax highlighting are relatively new and made a really big difference to kind of the end-to-end authoring experience. And we're going to talk about some of the new things that we've shipped in just the last few weeks. So up until about a month ago, we had our VS Code extension. So all the logic and all the sort of language support for ARM was built into the VS Code extension itself, which is a TypeScript process. But if you looked in the bottom right-hand corner of VS Code, you would see that the language was set to JSON. And if we really want to start treating ARM templates as the language that we know that it is, then we need something called a language service. And this is what actually runs and does a lot of the sort of language features that you see in languages like C# or JavaScript. And so now in VS Code in the bottom right corner, and we'll demo this, you'll see Azure Resource Manager template is the language that is running. So what is a language service? It's a .NET Core process that runs to the side of VS Code, and it basically just helps us do assistive language stuff, which is a technical term. There's quite a few new features here that we'll show you some of them today, and I just want to walk through them all quickly. The first one is support for kind of standard // and /* comments. In order to really document your code and teach people about the code that you've written, comments are absolutely vital, and there hasn't been kind of first-class support for comments up until recently. How many of you knew that you can actually put // and /* comments in an ARM template? A few of you. So it's kind of like a secret that we've had, that the ARM template actually deploys totally successfully, but the tools didn't always treat comments correctly. So you would get false positives in VS Code, or certain commandlets or clients wouldn't be able to deploy them. We've solved a lot of those, and so you can start to rely on comments. Multi-line strings is the next one. I have been on calls with some of you, and you've shown me some horrifying single lines of JSON with lots of expressions and lots of things like that. And so allowing you to break this down over multiple lines is just a big quality of life improvement and readability. Case insensitivity, so ARM has secretly been case insensitive this whole time as well. It's another one of those things that would get flagged as a false positive because JSON is case sensitive while ARM is case insensitive. So we're not going to flag that as a false positive anymore. We added snippets to the extension, so Sam is in the audience here. Sam Kogan has run this ARM template snippets extension in VS Code for the past few years, and it's really helpful and vital for getting started and getting exposed to what's possible. So we asked him very nicely if we could take that work over for him. He was very happy to stop maintaining that. So that's now built into the extension proper. And it's open source, so you can go to that link. It has actually been open source, but we haven't always paid attention to the repo. So we will be paying attention to that and accepting PRs. So please do check that out and contribute snippets that you know are vital. We sort of overhauled Intellisense in the language service. So this is really where we were starting to hit the limits of what the extension could do. And now that we have a dedicated language service, we're much more performant with our Intellisense, and we can analyze a much broader set of resource schemas than we were capable of doing before. And we'll talk about that in the demo. And support for more schemas. So the schema file at the top of the file could only take so many resource type schemas before the editors would start to slow down. So we've actually published a new root schema, and the extension is going to push you and show you a notification to switch over to the new root schema. And that's where we're going to be publishing all the new ones, and we're starting to auto-generate them. So you should start to see way more support for more resource types. If you've ever seen this API version is not supported or this resource type doesn't exist, even though you know that it does and it deploys successfully, that was the reason. And so those errors are going to start to go away. And then across the board, just a general reduction of false positives. You should be able to rely on VS Code showing you a red squiggly and knowing that that's actually going to lead to a deployment failure. When you see a sea of red squiggles and you know half of them are meaningless, then all of them become meaningless. So you need to be able to see those and identify those and act on them as quickly as possible. Okay, let's demo it. Awesome. So I am in a standard JSON file right now. I haven't written any ARM template code, which is why you see JSON in the bottom right-hand corner here. So let's start authoring from scratch. People say nobody authors ARM from scratch, and I'm going to show you that it's actually totally possible now that we have some of these new language capabilities. So to start, I'm just going to type ARM, and that shows me some of the new snippets that we have in the extension, one of which is just a skeleton ARM template. So this is a valid ARM template now. This would successfully deploy. Yeah. And then immediately, one in the bottom right corner, you're seeing that it says Azure Resource Manager template. So I have confidence that the language service is actually running. And then I'm getting this notification to switch me to the new root schema. So it's 2015 up at the top of the file. And then when I switch to use latest, it's going to switch to this 2019 schema. And this is the one that we're going to continue to populate and continue to grow. So let's keep authoring. I'm going to go to my resources section of the ARM template and add a resource. I'll start typing Cosmos. Come on, there it is. And I get another snippet, and this will deploy successfully as well. And I can start to make modifications. So one, there's tab completion on the snippet. So if you author the snippet correctly, you get tab completion. So I can change the name of the Cosmos DB account. And I can do tab completion. I start to see some of the Intellisense, so I see the options for the kinds that I can choose. And I can just continue to tab through here until I filled out all the values that I need to fill out until it's a valid template. I can start to add comments to the template and start to document my code. So I can say here, this shows up as Cosmos DB in the portal. Sometimes that can be confusing for people when the ARM template looks different than what you see in the portal. I can comment out certain lines. So if I don't want there to be tags in this, I can comment it out. The ARM backend will ignore this just like you would expect any other comment. If I want to get rid of it entirely, I can. I can do a block comment and move the entire thing. So this is really just to help you improve that dev test loop. If you have one particular resource that is causing you trouble and that's the only one you want to test, you can comment everything out. So again, this is just a quality of life improvement for you. So let's author a resource from scratch. This has always been hard because I don't know where to even begin. What properties do I need for any given resource type? So the first thing I need, does anybody know what's the first property that I need for any resource declaration? Type, exactly. So the first thing I see is type. And then if I do colon, then I start to see all the resource types that I have available to me. So I can start to scroll through here or start typing ahead. And I can do container. And I can do container instances. What's next? Anybody know? API. And I see here that not only am I told API version, I'm actually going to precisely locate all the API versions for just container groups and container instances in this case. So I can go to the latest one, and I can just keep going. If I scroll through here, I see the properties not only that I can choose, so I can do things like copy loops and dependencies and things like that, but I also see that certain properties are required. So I know that I need a name. My ACI. And where things get really interesting is on the properties. So this has always been a challenge. You know, some of these top-level properties are standard across the ARM template, but it's when I've gotten into properties that I really have no idea what I need to do, and I would have to start looking at documentation. But now I can actually do Intellisense on the properties themselves. So I can start to really just learn about the resource. It's actually a great API exploration tool now, because I can just flip around and use type ahead and see what's out there. Not only do I see the keys, the properties that I can choose from, I also will get descriptions of what these properties are. If I select this, I'll see that if it has a specific set of values, that will come up as well. So overall, you should just see kind of a major change in your day-to-day of authoring, and the tool should really walk you through and teach you a lot more about the ARM templates. Not bad, right? Okay, next up is a feature that we're calling What If. So ARM templates have been hard to deploy because it's sort of like you're throwing it over the fence to us and just praying that it's going to work, right? You get very little feedback up until recently about what that template was going to do. If you've used features like Terraform Plan or Pulumi has something similar, it's very similar to what they've done, and it's really to give you as much information as possible before you hit what is sometimes a scary deployment button. So I'm going to walk you through how What If works, and then we'll do a demo of it. In order to do a What If call, I need to know everything about the template. So we need the ARM template. We need the target scope, so what resource group or subscription or management group or tenant that you're going to deploy it to. I need a parameters file or the parameters to be listed, and I need the deployment mode, which for most people is incremental, but some of you may also be doing complete mode deployments. I then send it to ARM, or I send it to Azure, and we do two things when it gets sent to us. One is to predict the desired state. So we take that template, we resolve all the functions, resolve all the parameters, and get a good idea of what that set of resources is actually going to look like. And then we'll also do GET requests on all the resources that are in that scope. So if it's a net new deployment and there's nothing in there, it'll come back quickly, and everything will be creations in the What If output. But if there are resources that already exist, then we'll get those resources and then do the comparison. Once we have all that information, we run it through our noise suppression service. And this is the hard part of What If, is making sure that there's no noise in your response. And I'll talk through a little bit more about why this is a challenge and how we're tackling this problem. Once that's done, I get a calculated diff. So we'll see, you get a nice clean output of what we think that we're going to do. We'll show you a list of the resources, what action we're going to take on that resource, whether it's an update, a creation, a deletion, or if we're going to ignore the resource. And then you have all the information that you should need to confidently say, I want to do this deployment or I don't want to do this deployment. Sometimes there may be an extra resource that you're not expecting, or there's some function that's not resolving because of a syntax error, and you'll start to see a lot of these things in the what if response. So let's talk about the noise suppression service and why this is so critically important to making sure what if works well. This is the body of a put request. I hope it's not too small. Basically, it's a small set of properties that you could put in an ARM template, or you could do it in the API directly. This is all you need today to create a storage account successfully. The challenge is what it looks like when you do a GET request on that same resource. It's almost comically different how many more properties there are in the GET request than there is in the put. And if we just did a raw diff, you would see all these extra properties come back. What if we think you wanted to delete all those properties because you didn't declare them in the put request to create the resource? So this is the challenge. We need to start to catalog all these things. Some of them can be done in an automated way. Some of them need to be done manually, at least for now. Okay, let's start to demo, and we can see what this is all about. So I have a template here, and then I have my PowerShell core terminal on the right. It's a pretty standard, simple ARM template. So I have a virtual network, and I have two subnets here. Not too many functions. Almost everything is hard-coded, pretty straightforward. So we'll do our new AZ deployment what if command on this template, and we'll wait for the response. So it's doing those two steps right now. One is it's going to do the validate call to see what this is going to look like when we unpack everything, and then it's going to do gets on the resources. It's not going to see any resources, so if everything validates successfully, we hope to see a bunch of green text here because that means it's all correct. So we see here this is a what if response, a create what if response. At the top, I can see the resource type, the virtual network, and I can see all the properties. For the most part, things look the same as the template because everything was hard-coded. But you'll notice here that the location actually got resolved. So on the left, it was resource group.location, and on the right, it's East US because we actually, I don't know what's happening here. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's try that again. The demo gods are not being kind to me right now. I really don't appreciate it.
We hit the limits of VS Code.
I may need to close this and reopen it. No kidding. So now we're going to deploy it. Network resource provider is actually quite fast, so this should come back pretty quickly. And this is pretty standard. This is a command that a lot of you are probably very familiar with. We're going to do the deployment, the VNet, and the subnets will get created, hopefully in just a few seconds. And then once that is done, we'll edit some properties of the file. Oh, this is an old version of the file. Apologies here. I'm going to run this one more time because it actually used an old version of the template. And while we're waiting for that, let's make some changes to the file. So let's do a couple things. Let's get rid of one subnet. And let's change the address prefix from 16 to 15. And so our network got created as we desired it. And now let's do the what if one more time. So this is going to be a real honest to goodness what if, right? Because we've already created it and we've made some changes. So let's see how that manifests. Now it'll take slightly longer because it's not only going to unpack the resources, it's actually going to do the gets on the existing resource and do the comparison. So that's the what if response. Pretty clean, right? So at the top, I have a key to say what all these colors and symbols mean. Minus is a delete, plus is a create, and a squiggle is a modify. So I see that this resource is going to get modified. I'll talk about these two properties in a second, but let's first look at the changes that we made. So we see that the address prefix is captured, that change is identified, and we see that the subnet got removed, and it will actually remove this subnet. So this is telling me correctly that the subnet is going to be removed, and the address prefix is going to change. Now, on the properties, we see enable DDoS protection and enable VM protection. This is a classic example of a false positive. Because I didn't declare it in the template, it was actually a default value that the VNet automatically assigns to the resource. So it comes back and it says, you didn't declare this in the template, so I think I'm about to go delete this. At this point, we have a few options. One, and we'll talk about this, you're going to file a GitHub issue in our GitHub repo to tell us about it. And two, you can either ignore it and say, I know that's noise and I don't want to deal with it and I'll just ignore it. Or you can actually add it to the template itself. And so we can show what that process looks like if you want your what if outputs to be clean. So Intellisense is our friend here. We see enable DDoS protection, that same setting. We can set it to false, just like it is in the default value. And I see enable VM protection, which I'll also set to false. And now when I do the same what if call, it should be clean. So I should only see the changes that are actually going to happen. And so we'll start to work through the default values in particular are kind of a unique challenge, but we'll start to catalog all these things and the resources, the what if responses will get cleaner and cleaner over time. So now you're seeing basically a perfect what if. It's only telling me exactly what's going to change and nothing more. Pretty cool? Yep. Cool. So we are going to make this available in private preview starting today. So you can sign up at this AKA link, aka.ms/armtemplate-previews. Notice that that's a plural, so that's not our only private preview of today. You're primarily helping us identify false positives. Obviously, we need help testing the commandlets and making sure the formatting is good and all that sort of good stuff. But for the most part, we want to reduce this noise as fast as possible. So we're going to give ourselves a few months to make sure we drive this down before we make it available in public preview. This will only get good if you help us make it good. So this really needs to be a distributed kind of open source process because there's just so many resource types out there and there's only so much of this that we can automate. So we've opened a GitHub repo at aka.ms/whatifissues where you can submit an issue. The issue template has all the details that you need to give us so that we can take an action on it. And we're going to try to close that loop within 2 weeks. So we need a few deployments to be able to get that resolved and get the output to be clean. So that is everything I have for you today. Brian is going to take over and do the second half and has some really, really cool stuff to talk to you about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so you guys know how quickly 45 minutes can go when you have content that's this exciting and this compelling. So I'm just going to jump right in. Deployment scripts. So I often get this question. I've been working on ARM templates really kind of since the beginning and get this question, can I do this in a template? Can I do this or that or whatever the scenario may be? How do I do it in a template? And you go through this process of is there an RP for it? Does the resource provider allow it? Is there a template language construct that I can use? What do I do? Sometimes the answer is no, you can't do it in a template. And that's just the limitation of the declarative language. The good news is now the answer is always going to be yes, because we are going to release a new resource that will allow you to deploy an arbitrary script in an ARM template. So if you have a Powershell script or a Bash script, you can run it in a template deployment and use that as part of your infrastructure. The bad news is we have a new resource that allows you to deploy an arbitrary script in a template deployment. And so why is that bad? So if you think of the model, config as code, ARM is declarative. In that declarative template, you state the end goal that you want ARM to reach. This is what I want. ARM will go make it so for you. You don't have to figure out how. You just tell ARM what you want and it will do it for you. When we get into this space of running these scripts, that's no longer true. Now you have to start thinking in your scripts, you have to think idempotently and you have to think declaratively. How do I make sure that that script is going to run the same every time when I give it the same set of inputs? And now the burden is now on the developer to do that. And as I was actually doing this, the script for this demo, I did a really simple script. And it's harder than you think. And so the more that you do it, the more problems you'll run into because you're going to mix those models of a declarative and imperative deployment. And it just puts more burden on you to get things right. And to give you kind of an example of that, and this is a little bit of, there's kind of two sides of this. Inside of Microsoft, we're not allowed to use it. So we went and we sat down with Mark Russ and said, hey, Mark, we want to go do this resource. Customers need it. It fills gaps. They're blocked by things, and we're making it difficult. We need to do it. He was all in. And then he said, you can't use it. I want a policy inside of Microsoft so that you can't use it. And the reason for that is because if we use it for that, that means we're masking some problem in the platform. There's some limitation or some gap in the platform. And if we don't feel that pain, we won't fix it, and you guys will feel the pain. So that was actually a good thing. And then I went through my demo and kind of had this question of like, is my demo script, is it idempotent? Is it declarative? Is it good? And I didn't know as I was thinking of it. And I said, okay, fine, I'll go find out. And I'll go write an idempotent script and we'll demo that. And then I thought that really wasn't the point. The point was the fact that I had to think about it. The fact that that was now part of that script that I used it for. I've used it in pipelines. But now I had to start thinking about it differently because I wanted to use it in a template deployment. And I think that's the point that I wanted to make. So the resource provider, again, I'm going to give a little bit of just caution as we go into explaining this, when not to use it. Not when it's just because it's convenient. So everybody starts their journey, you go deploy some resources in the portal, and then you go look at PowerShell or you look at CLI, and you learn how to deploy things. And so you've already got that CLI script that's going to do this part of the deployment. You could either go figure out how to do it in an ARM template, or you could just stuff it into a deployment script. Didn't have that option before, and you do now. But that's not going to necessarily make things better. Even if it unblocks you in the short term, you're eventually going to have to come to those pain points again. So just because some things seems like it's too hard or you can't figure out how to do it, that's not a good reason. One of the things that we had talked about internally as we were looking at examples for this is I could go and create a blob container inside this deployment script. And we kind of had the conversation come back to is you can already do that in an ARM template today. So you don't need the deployment script to do that. So exhaust those things first. And then of course also we need to keep the feedback loop going. Again, tell us if we have gaps in there. If you find places where you need to use this, let us know so that we can go close those gaps in the platform. Because if you guys don't tell us where we're making things hard, we just continue to make things hard for you. So keep that feedback loop going. If you find yourself needing to use this, that's an opportunity for us to get that feedback. So the good news, or the fun stuff, when can I use it? The first thing I would say is keep the scripts simple. The longer they get, the harder it is going to be to make sure you've got all the try catches in there, the idempotency is in there. It's just going to make it that much harder. So the smaller the script, the better. And there are a lot of good examples for that. When you get into the more difficult scripts, think about the other avenues that are out there. So you can run tasks in the pipeline. And actually the script that I'm going to show today, last time I demoed it, it was part of a pipeline task and it worked just fine in my overall deployment. So think of those things because it'll be easier for you to debug and manage those scripts likely outside of a template. The custom resource provider is another option. How many people know what the custom resource provider is? We talked about it a little bit yesterday. Okay, so custom resource provider is a resource provider. The simplest example is you have an Azure function. That Azure function does something, like it could create a certificate or a service principal. You can call that in an ARM template by wrapping it into a custom resource provider. And now you have something that looks exactly like all the other resources. It calls your code out in a function or whatever endpoint you want to spin up, and then it can return things into the ARM deployment. So it gives you another way to do that. Data plane operations are a good example. So you want to go spin up a SQL database and you need to set up a number of users in that SQL database. So you've got a T-SQL script that does that. You want to go run that in a template deployment. Now this is an example where you can do that. Deploying code to a Linux web app, so this is one I ran across a couple weeks ago where someone was trying to figure out how to privately deploy code from a repo to a Linux web app. If you're in a Windows web app, you can use an MS deploy package, so you can build it and shove it through your pipeline and you can deploy it that way. Linux doesn't support web deploy, and so one way to do that would be to take this deployment script resource and go wrap your deployment in that. Hybrid networking scenario, so you think, hey, I've got some IP addresses that I need to know either in Azure or on-prem. I need to map those through a deployment. Something that you need to get like that. A couple here, any Azure Active Directory or cryptographic operations are really good. They're not strongly supported in templates. So you think creating certificates, app registration, service principals, things like that. And license checks is one. So you want to go, during a deployment, go out, check a license server, find out how many cores you can deploy in this deployment. That's another good example. I've starred these last two, and because again, I want to reiterate, those are actually really good examples for custom resource provider or custom RP, because it's something that's probably going to happen over and over and over again, and you want to actually share that code, and so it makes an easy way to do that through the custom RP as opposed to just kind of a one-off thing in a deployment. So how does it work? Really simple. We spin up a storage account and a container instance in your subscription. In that container, we run a particular image, and these are actually images that are in the Microsoft registry. The one we have right now is PowerShell. We'll soon have Bash. So you can go spin up those images on your own and kind of do your own debug beforehand if you want to. There will be a user-assigned identity that will run that script. And so before you run the script, you can set up the identity. You can do that in the template. You could also do it outside of the template, set up the permissions for that identity, and then pass it into the script. And eventually we'll also support the managed identity. The resource has provisions for timeouts, failures, retention, debugging. Think of those scenarios, and I'll show those when we get into the resource. And then it returns when the script is finished. So you think today, today you can spin up a container and you can run a script on it, all in a template, but that's going to be asynchronous and it's going to return right away. This is going to wait until that's finished, and then it will also return outputs if you choose to use those. So again, for the preview link, so if you're interested in trying this out, and we're interested in having you try it out to see how it's working for the scenarios, that same link that Alex shared earlier, go there and you can tell us which one you're interested in. All right, so let's take a look. So this is the script I had. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a certificate. And when I first wrote this and I had this in my pipeline, there's really two things that I need to do here. I set up a policy, and I use a key vault commandlet to go ahead and deploy it. When you do that, the cert is created. It's an asynchronous command. It takes a few seconds for the cert to actually be available in key vault. So I go try to get it after that. And if it's not there, then I'm just going to sleep for a bit and I'll try again. And so this is going to do that end-to-end create the cert for me. The things that are new in this script now are this deployment script's output variable. So this is a variable that you can assign things to, and when you assign it to that, those are the things that are available in the ARM template as you go and you do that deployment. So it's a hash table. You can put anything you want in there in terms of an output. And if you declare it in your scripts, you can run it offline. So I can run this script interactively. It'll work the same way that it will when I run it inside of the container. And then I even have some debugging in here as well. That'll work just fine in the resource. So this was my question. So when you guys look at this, how many people think this thing is idempotent? Good. How many people don't think it is? How many people have no idea? That was where I was. And actually, I'm still there, except as I was running it, I found a few problems in it. One thing here is I actually have an infinite loop that I ran into because these commands failed, and then this command never finished. And so I have this feature over here in the script that will allow it to time out. Good thing that we have that, because otherwise my deployment would have sat there until I canceled it. So when I have this script, the nice thing is I'm going to just copy it. I'm going to take it over into my resource and then paste it in. I actually want it to look a little better than that. So there's my inline script. So we'll save that, we'll go run it, and then I'll come back and explain what the properties are. So in the resource itself, So this is a very simple template. It just has that deployment scripts resource in it. I have some parameters that I'm passing in for the script itself. All of this up here is going to look very familiar, same as any other resource through the common properties. Here's my user assigned identity, and I pass that in. My kind is PowerShell, and we'll have a CLI bash version as well. And then the properties for the resource itself, this one is probably the most important property that's in here in terms of unique behavior. So normally when you put a resource in ARM, and kind of as Alex showed in What If, you say, this is the declaration, this is what I want. And so the resource provider looks at all those properties, and it says, okay, what's the difference between the properties and what I have? And if they're the same, the resource provider doesn't do anything. In this script provider, a lot of times everything's going to be the same. The parameters are going to be the same, the command's going to be the same. Nothing changes, so it won't run again. So we have this property, and it's a property that's also used on virtual machine extensions that will allow you to forces a property change, basically. And so that it will make sure that that will actually run. So particularly when you're debugging, I'm just passing in a GUID, and that's going to run every time I deploy. If you want to control when it deploys, you can change the parameter value, and you can pass it in or change it when you want to have it run. So the other things you'll see here, there's Azure Powershell version. We'll have the same thing for CLI. Timeout, this is for when you have infinite loops in your script, like I did. The retention interval, this is how long do I keep that thing in my subscription. So it's a kind of a transient resource, so we'll spin it up, but we don't want it to sit there forever because you usually don't need it there forever. So you can decide how long that remains in your subscription or in your resource group, and then when to clean up. So if you want to clean up on a success, or if you want to clean up also on failure. On failure, you might want to wait and debug, or you can also just clean it up right away if you know you're going to debug elsewhere. And of course, so there's arguments for the script. Get that so you can see a little bit more. And I just had the three parameters I had for my script, so the vault, the certificate, and the subject name. And I'm going to pass those in as the parameters that came into the template. You can also use environment variables. This one is showing how you secure an environment variable. So I can have a plain text environment variable. That'll work fine if I just pass in the value. If I pass in a secure value, that means it'll never be available outside of that container instance. And that's actually the same way that ACI works. And then, of course, I have all my script content inline, and then in the outputs. So when I had in my script, you can see here I've got my output still. So the outputs property is going to contain that specific one that I defined. So we hop back over here to the deployment. There's my thumbprint that I defined. And then I also output a couple other properties that are on that resource. The container instance ID and the storage account ID, those are the resource IDs of the resources that we automatically spun up. And because we automatically spin them up, we'll give them a random name, so there's no collisions. But if you needed to debug something, you would know which instance to go to. Or if you were ready to delete it, you know which instance that you can delete. And so that's the outputs of the script. The last thing that I'll show here is rather than put your script in line, you can also do this. You can also pass in a URI, and you can have other scripts that are not the primary script. This is just the one that's going to get executed. You can pass in other scripts as well through the URI. So if you had more things that you needed to do when you ran that, you have the ability to do that. So that's that. What else is on the list? So another thing that we started working on is the ARM Template Toolkit. So this is another thing that we're just starting to do, so let's preview. It's static analysis for ARM templates, and then also create UI definition, which is a file that you'll use in managed applications and in the marketplace. And it looks at those files and tries to determine, are you using good coding practices? Are you doing things that are likely to succeed or fail? Are you doing things that are going to cause unexpected problems? So it doesn't tell you necessarily, is it going to succeed? It's not a replacement for what if, it's not a replacement for validate, but it's a static code analysis and really around best practices. So there are a couple links where you'll be able to get this, or right now all the code is in the quick start repo, and it'll stay there for a while, but eventually this will probably get broken out into its own repo, so you'll have these AKA links that you can always use. It's a set of PowerShell tests, runs on PowerShell, PowerShell Core. Most of the time we're running it on PowerShell Core. We've actually been running it in our own pipelines for a couple months. So the quick start repo, if you've ever been there, we run that as part of the CI/CD process, and in the marketplace when we validate templates, we're also running it there. Still in preview, and so there are bugs that we're working on. That's why we kind of haven't gone out real broadly with this yet. It's actually, as you probably know if you've tried, it's really, really hard to take a language like ARM and all the things you can do in it and determine what the developer is doing or what's actually going to happen in a particular expression. So it's taking us a while to go through that. And if you look at the commit history, you'll see like, yeah, there's a lot of changes as we learn how complicated this is. And one of the things that we're doing with it is we're actually taking all the quick start templates, and we'll actually throw badges on the quick start template. We can tell you, does that thing deploy in public Azure? Does it deploy in Azure Government? Does it follow the best practices? Does it have security issues? It's a community repo. Some of them are pretty old. Some of them predate a lot of the practices and guidance that even we've given out. So this is a way that you can start to evaluate some of those things. Actually, I'll go back and I'll show that real quick. So I've imported the commandlet on this machine. So there's a set of commandlets that are up there, and I've imported it. And when I want to run it, I can just take it and point it at a folder, and it's going to evaluate everything in that folder. And so if you take a look at this, the way it starts, it'll tell you what template am I testing, what tests am I testing for that template, and then the results of all those tests. And so green is good, red is bad. This one does not use a literal string for an admin username. So it'd be a practice that would increase surface area from a security perspective. So you want that to be a parameter that's passed in. API versions is another practice that we try to enforce to keep those up to date. You'll see a lot of things happen that are behind the scenes in API versions, and I realize we don't always make do a good job of telling you guys what that is, but we do a lot of things internally in those, and then there's also new features that come. So we like to make sure that those things are fairly up to date. And so this will tell you what's not using it, what the latest versions are as you go through that test. And then you can see some other ones here. Now these are all just, a lot of these are documented, some of them are, some of them aren't. You can kind of tell what they are from the test description there. But we'll check things like the location and use of resource group location. It's great for a dev test scenario, but once you start to roll things out, that can actually cause problems in your deployment. So it's a test that you can run. You can also decide not to run that test if that's the way that you always want to do your deployments. So that's real quick, that's the Template Toolkit. So the next is just a list of things that we've done in the template language and just little bits and pieces. We're kind of chipping away at a backlog and kind of some of the user voice suggestions that you guys have given us. Some of these have been out for a while, some of them are new, and some of them are not out yet. And I'll talk through that real quick. Copy count of 0, so you can do a copy loop with a 0 as the count, and it won't fail your deployment. We released that. Somebody on Twitter pointed out that we had a bug in the batch size, so you couldn't do a batch size of 0. We fixed that, so that's better now. The environment function will give you information about the cloud environment that you're deploying in. So if you're deploying in Azure Stack, public cloud, government cloud, you can get information specific to that cloud. So you don't have to hard code endpoints that aren't available through reference and things like that. Array copy, so you can do a copy loop and generate an array, not just an object. There is short circuiting in the if function. So if you have two sides of an if function and one of them you know is not going to be evaluated and it may be invalid because maybe you have an index out of bounds or something like that, that would cause your template deployment to fail. We put in the short circuiting, so if it's not going to be executed, then we don't care if that part is valid or not. A couple resource ID functions. So now that we have new scope deployments, which I'll talk about in the next slide, we have resource ID functions to generate resource IDs for those scope of resources. And then the last three with the star, these are ones that are, there's anywhere from code review to being deployed. They're not live yet, but they should be soon in the next couple weeks. Inline deployments is the big one. And so this is, if you use nested deployments in an ARM template, and you have a link template, that template deploys just like you think it would. It evaluates like you think it would, it works like you think it would, just like a standalone template. You bring that same template and you put it inline in the deployment, and it's going to change behavior. And there are some of those changes you actually can't get around. And so what we've done is we've made it so that inline deployments will actually behave as that link deployment. You can actually say, hey, I want this to behave in its own scope. All the functions, parameters, outputs should be within the scope of that deployment and not its parent. So we're fixing that. And that will enable a lot of other scenarios where you could do inline deployments where you couldn't today and kind of avoid the need to do the link template. Condition false resources, they're now pulled from the graph, we call it, in the template evaluation engine, so that you can actually have those be invalid. They don't actually have to validate correctly because they're not going to be deployed. So you can do that, and then you don't have to worry about your deployment failing. The other part of that is it will also remove the resource from the resource group or from the scope in complete mode. So that previously it would not do that because that resource was evaluated and still present. But now because we're removing it, that means when in complete mode, that resource will be removed during that deployment. And then copy output, we can actually use the copy loop in outputs. So you can output things like an array of IP addresses that were deployed during that deployment. We won't have time to go through all the code of that, but there are samples in the repo there at the bottom if you want to take a look. And then the last bit, we have new template deployment scopes. So you can deploy a template to management group scope and tenant scope. And that complements the subscription scope and resource group scope that are there today. The REST API is capable of doing that right now. We still have to get PowerShell and CLI support out. That should be out this month. And there are some things like you can't create a subscription in a tenant level or management group level deployment yet. We still have some commerce work we need to do to light that up. The Azure DevOps task has been updated to support those scopes, or one of them has right now, and the other one will come. So if you're using classic pipelines and you use that task, if you change to the preview version, they've got that version thing at the top, you change to the preview version, you'll see the new scopes available for deployment in there. And then in export template, we've done a lot of work over the last probably 6 months, a year, just trying to make that cleaner and make it work better for you guys. And so there's single resource export is one thing. We have the ability to optionally export parameters. So if you ended up with a lot of parameters and they were too verbose and it didn't follow your naming convention, you can say don't export parameters and just leave it raw, and it'll give you the raw template back. The API actually has a few more options than the portal. So if you look at PowerShell and CLI for that export template, you'll see that there are a couple other things you can do to tailor that export to make it work better for you. And the last thing, so whatever we didn't get to, so Alex or myself, if you ever have any questions, you ever have any feedback, please reach out to us. And again, because I always say this, if you don't tell us what we're doing wrong, we're going to continue to do it wrong. And if we ever end up getting too much email, I'll stop putting it up here on the slide. So please feel free to reach out to us, whatever you run across. If we can make something better, let us know that so that we can do that for you. That's all I have. Thanks for coming.